thank you everyone again for joining us. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone joining from all around the world. My name is Alejandro Roemer, and I'm a PhD student in political science at the University of Chicago. And I'm very excited to be moderating this panel on the global, regional, and local implications of Operation Absolute Resolve. Again, thank you so much to Sarah Dorr of the International Studies Association for organizing this panel, providing this space. And let me start by introducing our wonderful panel of speakers and by giving a brief overview of the structure to follow. I should stress that everyone is speaking at a personal level and not on behalf of their respective organizations. Let me start by introducing Donatella Ungreda. Donatella is a Venezuelan-American bilingual translator and interpreter and journalist with a background in radio and TV broadcasting. After moving to the United States in the year 2000, she co-founded the first fully internet-based 24/7 radio station, which later achieved a Guinness World Record for a 40-hour live talk show highlighting Venezuelan political prisoners. She was the first vice president of the Association of Venezuelan Journalists Abroad, and Donatella also produces and hosts the global shortwave program Freedom Synergy Radio, which is broadcast in English. Thank you, Donatella, for joining us. And we also have Douglas Ungreda. Douglas holds a PhD in economics from the Universidad Central de Venezuela, where he is an associate professor in macroeconomics. He is also an adjunct professor at the MBA program Urbe in University of Miami, Florida. His expertise are in international financial macroeconomics and risk management. He resides in the United States since 2023. Thank you, Douglas, for joining us. Next, we have
My pleasure.
Next, we have Hope Dancy, who is a PhD candidate at the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on international law, sovereignty, and governance, with particular attention to how legal and commercial arrangements structure political authority beyond the state. Thank you, Hope. And lastly, we have Daniel Wagner, who is a lecturer and assistant professor at the Department of International Relations and the European Forum at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research focuses on the international legitimacy, populist foreign policy, conflict resolution, and regional integration, with an emphasis on their interplay in the realm of Latin American, European, and Middle Eastern politics. His most recent academic articles have appeared in International Studies Review, International Affairs, Journal of European Integration, Comparative European Politics, Journal of Global Security Studies, Globalizations, and International Studies Quarterly. He was also the co-editor of a recent special issue on international affairs on the effects of global populism. He was also the co-editor of the volume Populist Foreign Policy, Regional Perspectives of Populism in the International Scene. Thank you again to all our wonderful panelists for joining us. And as I said, I'll provide some brief structure as to how this roundtable discussion will proceed. I'd like to start by acknowledging that there are many possible angles to interpret the recent developments in Venezuela. We have considered that a productive structure would be to layer the discussion into three broad scopes of implications. We will start with the global, touching on questions surrounding international law and great power competition. We will move on to the regional, touching on the developing Done Road Doctrine, quote unquote, and the implications for Cuba, Mexico, and Colombia. And we will conclude with what's arguably the most immediately important, and possibly also not only the most immediately, but the most relevant, the future of the Venezuelan people and the livelihood of its citizens. What's to come for the brave people of Venezuela? Should we expect occupation, democratization, or something in between? Of course, I should advance that the borders between these categories are blurry. The local necessarily spills over into the regional into the global, and the same occurs in the reverse order. So I'd like us to explore the tension between these categories. Maybe what's desirable for the international order is not necessarily desirable for the Venezuelan people, and vice versa. So that's kind of the structure we'll follow for in the discussion moving on. And I should also stress that this situation is very fluid. Things are changing every day and sometimes even by the hour. So this discussion is only up until January 13 of 2026. For the audience member joining us, feel free to use the QA section to send your questions. We will get to as many as we can at the end of the roundtable discussion. So thanks again, and let's get started. As per the structure we have laid out, let's begin with exploring the global implications of Operation Absolute Resolve. Everyone should feel free to jump in, but let me start by asking Daniel. Speaking of the global, Daniel, is Venezuela a proxy stage for great power competition? US versus China, US versus Russia, and if so, how would this intervention reshape the geopolitical landscape?
First of all, thank you very much for everyone there. I cannot see you, but it's good to be with you. And thanks for organizing this amazing panel. Yes, in a way, it's part of a great power competition, that for sure, right? It's a signal that the US, the United States, is sending other medium to, let's say, potential hegemonic countries, right? Candidates to hegemony, that the US is willing to play the hegemon card. That means it's willing to use military force to achieve its own national interest or domestic interest. In some case, we can discuss it later. But, and I should say but, it's mainly a signal in a way, not necessarily a drive. I mean, I'm not sure that this was the reason for why going and doing this operation, but it's a consequence, potentially an unintended consequence, or a supplementary consequence. The Venezuelan crisis, we need to understand, has its own dynamics, okay? Against what we see in current international coverage or even analysis by experts and pundits, this is not new. I mean, the crisis was there for at least 12 years, right? For at least 2014, right? And so we need contextualization here, okay? This is a 12-year crisis with several cycles, right? After elections, right? The different fraud in elections and mass demonstrations and violations of human rights. And then several times there was discussion on whether military intervention was needed or another kind of more assertive intervention was needed. And there were sanctions and also regional organizations in Latin America, different regional organizations tried to act there, right? We are talking about the Organization of American States, we are talking about Mercosur, we are talking about discussions also whether within CELAC and UNASUR what to do. But in 2019, when military intervention was on the table, there was no support at those moments from regional friends. I have a paper on these issues tracing this process, and it's very clear there that the United States says, well, if there's no support from regional organizations here in Latin America on a potential military intervention, we will not do it. And I'm not speaking here about US administration of Joe Biden. I'm not speaking about previously Barack Obama. I'm speaking about Donald Trump, the administration of Donald Trump, just Trump 1.0. So within this contextualization, we need to understand what changed here, right? Trump 2.0, it's not Trump 1.0. It's not the same, not only regarding the policies toward the hemisphere, towards the region, but also, yes, in the world. There's a more assertive foreign policy, foreign and security policy. We need to understand what are not only the international drivers of this, but also the domestic drivers. I will be very happy to discuss them in the future. And for sure, they are also there when we talk about the policy of Trump's administration towards Greenland, towards Panama, yes, towards Iran. And in general, I will say that the global politics, I will call it the populist foreign policies of the United States today.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Daniel. And this is a really good context for us to get started in the conversation. We will touch later on the differences between, as you say, what you call the signals that are more of a consequence rather than the inherent motivation behind the operation, and also the domestic context that would and the regional context that would lead to this operation. But keeping in discussing the international scene and the geopolitical context, much has been commented on the illegality of the operation, right? The illegality of the unilateral use of force, entering Venezuelan airspace, capturing the head of state. So I'd like to turn to Hope and also provide us some context on this. I'd like to ask, can you help us understand what legal scholars mean by this and whether you agree? And I would also add, what would we need to see from the United Nations, other organizations, or the international community to believe that the rules-based international order still stands?
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. I just quickly to just go off what Daniel just said, when it comes to great power competition, I think what we're seeing right now is a US that doesn't really understand what its global strategy is going to be coming out of a bipolar, unipolar world. So it's interesting that the administration, consciously or not, I don't want to speculate on the inner workings of Trump's brain, but that they're kind of bringing back some of these old regional power politics that were present before the kind of great power bipolar Cold War moment. But as for international law, a lot of scholars really point to Article 2 of the UN Charter, which basically creates a norm against the use of force. There's probably one of the only things that the world has agreed on universally is that they have territorial sovereignty within their states. So the idea that another state can't come in and interfere with troops or capture people. Granted, there's a lot of holes in this, right? There's R2P, the responsibility to protect. I think there are countless states that are aware that they have adversaries around the world that they might want to go after. And so there is kind of this loophole built into the UN Charter that says if you do so for defense or the responsibility to protect or with the sanction of the UN Security Council, it's okay. None of those things are true for what has happened in Venezuela. But I think what's most important and what this kind of focus on the UN Charter and international law in this way misses is that the Trump administration didn't even try to justify what they were doing in the lens of international law, right? If you think back to Russia invading Ukraine, there was kind of this more responsibility to protect. We have Russians in Ukraine, we should invade. They were still speaking the language of international law. But what we have here is kind of this shift away from international law to transnational criminal law. And so it's being framed as policing, enforcement. And that's kind of a gap in the current international legal structure. We have, when we think about, let's say, criminal law, which is really what they've honed in on with Maduro as the justification, international criminal law, which would be war crimes, genocide, something like that. And they're used against people, but they're quite ineffective. So it typically goes to the ICC. And as we've seen, the ICC does not have that much power. They have a warrant out for Netanyahu, and his solution is to just not go to the places that are parties to the ICC. So it's kind of this weak international law. And then you have transnational law, which has a little bit more bite to it. It involves extradition. This is when people think of Interpol or something like that. And that policing is kind of a little outside international law. And so it's interesting that the US ended up framing what they're doing, not in international law, the way it's normally done, but kind of going towards this almost going around international law to this kind of loophole, weaker in enforcement, but stronger in their ability to act with transnational law. As for what we would need to see, right? The reason why this is so tricky and going around kind of international law to do this targeted enforcement on an individual is because the UN enforcement of that charter is very weak, right? It really comes down to whether or not you have countries willing to kind of hold others accountable. And so what we would really need to see is some sort of bigger action than just the rhetorical, this is bad, this is colonialism, this is a violation of the charter, because words are not exactly going to stop most countries, most great powers, but especially a US led by Donald Trump. So we would need to see some sort of ramification. I've been trying to think about things that could possibly happen. And, anyone's welcome to share with me their ideas. I have right now maybe kick them out of Five Eyes, have all of the other members of Five Eyes just say, you don't get our intelligence anymore. I'm not so sure. And I think that's why people are panicking. There's not a clear way out of this to really rebuild confidence in the international order, in the international rules-based order.
Thank you. That we will talk more about this, and I do want to get everyone else's thoughts on the issue before I move to the next question, in case you have one, on basically what Daniel was pointing out, the signals that are being sent to Russia, to China, to other potential competitors, and I'd like to bundle this up, Donatella and Douglas, with the next question that I have to you, which is, from your reading of the situation, how does Venezuela fit USA's grand geopolitical design, right? Is it just about the control of Venezuelan soil and securing the Western Hemisphere, or are there more motivations that meet the eye? How can we get a clue of what the future holds with how the events have unfolded as to right now?
Should I start?
Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for having me in this great panel discussion. It's a great opportunity for me. So, trying to answer your question, let's not forget that Venezuela is part of the Western Hemisphere. It is located just about 3 hours flight from the US and has been traditionally a friend of the US. It was also an ally during the World War II. It had, the past century in the 50s and 60s, had a great level of development that caused admiration, even here in the United States. So, and also the military forces collaborated very closely with the United States, and Venezuelan military officers came to the United States to take general staff courses until Hugo Chavez took power. So this is not just about a provisional control of Venezuelan oil, for instance, or which in my opinion will be a temporary thing. And it will surely move to something more equitable in a later phase. In my opinion, ultimately, I think it looks like an effort to rekindle, if you will, a friendship between nations that should never have been lost. And that only with legitimate authorities in Venezuela it will be possible to enjoy the fruits of that friendship. Let's put it this way. The Trump administration has a duty to the American people to ensure that it fulfills campaign promises to restore the country's greatness. The country's greatness is, depending on who sees it, but is the country's greatness. For several decades, America seriously neglected its relationship with other countries in the Americas. And it has focused on the Middle East and Asia. That neglect, intentional or not, created a vacuum that other powers, such as China and Russia, filled in at all levels. China, in particular, applied its own version of the Monroe Doctrine, and it is the Belt and Road Initiative. With it, it committed many countries with well-marketed infrastructure investments, and at this point, they have put the countries in a very difficult position to pay off those debts. In Venezuela, billions of dollars lent by China to the Chavista regime were consumed by corruption. And now China is collecting, and is collecting ruthlessly. So And as of the recent event, possibly giving clues as to what the future might bring. Again, the events are very fluid. We are still hoping, we are still, in the very early stages of dismantling the regime, which in my opinion is going very slowly. And we will only be able to see decisions being made and implemented as soon as possible. And again, Venezuela, believe me, want to see prosperity return. They need to get out of the misery that the Maduro regime has imposed on them. And with the United States, everything is negotiable, everything, as long as the game is played openly. You cannot do the same with China or with Russia, in my opinion.
Thank you, Donatella. And before I offer quick reactions, let me move on to Douglas. Maybe you have your own take on this.
Okay.
Question.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to be a part of this panel. I would like, as an economist, to bring some background perspective on where are we standing right now, because this is an entirely new ball game. In the recent past, and I'm speaking about very few years ago, there was a structure in which governments were possibly co-opted or bribed by transnational corrupt or criminal organizations. We had some interfering or participating elements here. For instance, globalization, which helped leverage not only legal goods and services, but also illegal goods and services to find rapid destiny to markets where there's a massive demand for illicit goods and services like drugs, mining, logging, wildlife trafficking, cyber enabling fraud, extortion, you name it. Then you've got the globalization processes help to lower the cost of doing business. So to this purpose, technologies also help the business model in terms of encrypted communications, platforms, payment platforms, cyber tools like blockchains, everything helping online payments. There's, at the same time, the dismantling and hollowing out of institutions to weaken governance, facilitating corruption and impunity to the point that transnational corrupt organizations are intermingling with international organizations like the Foro de Sao Paulo and financing left-leaning governments and failed governments, and they take charge of police, intelligence units, custom, tax, port authorities, procurement. So they impose a governance that provides a semblance of legitimacy that enables the laundering of illicit funds through the legal economy to the point that it's almost impossible to separate what's legal from what's not. So this is a business model that has been adopted in Venezuela, and I think it's an entirely complete animal from the classical structure. Therefore, what I do think that there is the adequate structure in terms of international law and order, but it's not applied in an efficient way. For instance, I'm thinking myself that some kind of RICO type of equivalent should be created at an international and global level, obviously adapting what exists because the tools exist, but we have a problem in terms of speed of response, speed of cross-border cooperation, financial transparency at scale, use targeted sanctions more strategically, and invest in UN policing and justice capacity, which exists but has to be flexibilized and speeded up. So we've got the wherewithal, but all this has to be coordinated. Obviously, there are geopolitical interests which are being compromised, especially by the states towards China and Russia, which makes this task all the more difficult. This is how I see it. And probably Venezuela will be a litmus test in many ways. It will rewrite many rules of engagement. So we could keep on talking about how the Maduro regime has cooperated with the FARC, the guerrillas, taking into account the borders between those two countries. And if you will, we could envision the Maduro regime as the likes of Pablo Escobar taking the presidency of Colombia, and taking absolute control of the police, the military, the armed forces, and even naming an ambassador to the UN. So this is the Venezuelan case.
Yes.
So we must be very creative in finding solutions, and possibly the American, the Trump probably must have taken the right decisions, or probably due to the wrong reasons. I don't know, but we can discuss this. There is plenty of scope for discussion.
Absolutely. And as you point out, Douglas, there's just overwhelming evidence in terms of the criminal links to the Venezuelan regime, as there is overwhelming evidence of Maduro's democratic illegitimacy. So this is a
bottom line.
Absolutely. This is
Bottom
a very
line,
interesting.
let me complete my line of reasoning. Bottom line, Venezuela has become a case of an institution that has been intervened by a new administration under, let's call it Chapter 11, which it does not apply necessarily, but it's a Chapter 11 intervention where they take control of the financial flows, the real flows, just to make sure that everything will fit in place, like it or not. And we will have them as our protector. And the narrative has to change somewhat. I would see it very hard for Trump to argue for $100 billion investment when they urge American citizens to scram out of the country. That sounds odd, to say the least. Okay, so many things in the marketing area have to change forcibly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Donatella, for your previous intervention. And Douglas, I want to really keep a tag on your last comment, because I think it ties to a discussion that hasn't really been held in the general media discussion, right? Which is legal scholars speak of the illegality of the intervention, but at the same time, as you correctly mentioned, Douglas, there's overwhelming evidence of the criminal nature of this government, of the democratically illegitimate nature of this government. So there's a question as to how should international law, if at all, should distinguish between the illegality of deposing an illegitimate leader versus the illegality of deposing a legitimate leader, if international law can do that at all. But I will save this for our last section on implications and on the interplay, as I said, between the local and the global, right? Because they don't necessarily match sometimes. So moving on with the sequence that we had considered, we would broadly say we have covered the main points that are being discussed regarding the global the global silo, right? But let me move on to the regional. So because of time, let me just ask you, Hope, really quickly to define or help us understand the developing Dunroe doctrine, and especially in light of the Operation Absolute Resolve. And I'll move on then to asking Daniel, how does this get us to the question of motivation? But let's start with you, Hope.
Absolutely. So the Dunroe Doctrine is inspired by this very long-standing U.S. Foreign policy stance, inspired by the Monroe Doctrine, which was made back in the 1820s under President Monroe, who basically made an agreement with Europe that the U.S. would not intervene in Europe if Europe did not intervene in the entire Western Hemisphere, which is a pretty passive approach. And so it's really important to remember that what's really happening with the Dunroe Doctrine is something closer to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is something Teddy Roosevelt instituted, where the U.S. can actually intervene in countries in the hemisphere. And so I think that's an important distinction to remember. Obviously, Dunroe sounds more fun. We know he loves a tagline. But it's this reassertion of actually like a really long-standing foreign policy stance. I wouldn't say this is particularly new for the US. It just moves between kind of more overt and covert policies. So we can all think of how, much the CIA loved to basically act on the Roosevelt corollary throughout the later half of the 20th century. But now it's like returning to a more overt, proclaimed stance to control the region.
I think this is thank you, Hope, a very useful context to segue into the question of motivations in the hemisphere, right? Regional motivations, which is something, Daniel, you already touched in your previous intervention, your previous commentary on the signals that the US is sending to its competitors, right? China, Russia. So let's get to the question of motivation. Is the intervention an effort to cement America's sphere of influence in the hemisphere and push out China's, Russia's, even Iran's and Hezbollah's influence in Latin America? And speaking of regional actors, right? You spoke of signals being sent, of messages being sent from the US to the world. Who else should be worried? Marco Rubio and Trump have been very explicit about settling their target on Cuba now. And they have also mentioned Mexico several times. Mexican cartels feature very heavily, very prominently in the indictment against President Maduro. And so how could the logic of law enforcement featured in this indictment be transplanted to places like Mexico?
Yes. I mean, I agree. I mean, yes, Trump's doctrine, and it's not coincidence that it was published, right, a few weeks ago, yes, reproduces Monroe's doctrine, or actually, as Hope said, the Roosevelt corollary, right? It's not only about America for the Americans and Europe for the Europeans, but America for the North Americans, and I'm willing to act in this case, at least discursively, right? And also some chirurgical actions and then cooptation, or at least this is the attempt. But I think, yes, I mean, I think we need to go broad, I mean, beyond that, and asking when Donald Trump and his administration, including Marco Rubio, that it's clear a great, player here, also because Secretary of State, but also because of his background, as you know, Cuban, and someone that in the last years, also even in 2018 and 19, he was there, right, trying to activate on behalf of, right, also hearing from Venezuelans in Florida, but also trying to act in their defense. So I think we need to think about what is that USA's greatness that Donatella was speaking before, right? What is that golden age that when Trump and Trumpism says, make America great again? What is that golden age, right? What is that restoration? And there was a discussion of whether it is returning to the after the Second World War, right, to the 50s, let's say 1950s, or it's even returning to the 1890s. That's Teddy Roosevelt, as Hope was saying. So I think we need to put it there, right? It's controlling the hemisphere. It's, in fact, avoiding Russian and Chinese presence there. We need to take into account. Maduro was receiving Chinese diplomats on Friday and calling by Biden names. So it's there, as we discussed before about great power competition. It's also it is also reminding the region that we are here and we are the leader. But it's more than that. It's about domestic politics. It's signaling also your own support base that we are delivering. And in this sense, we need to understand, yes, I mean, Venezuela, we speak here about Venezuela as a, somehow as a great power, right? Or even medium power, but it's a medium power in Latin America, right? And even if we consider GDP, right, it's even not closer, even not to Colombia, for sure not to Mexico that you are mentioning, Argentina, for sure Brazil, right? So even in military terms, it was in a way an easy goal. And we are receiving more and more evidence from what we are hearing, that this is also the way that decision-making in the US was thinking. So this is, we speak about motivation and how the region, in this sense, plays a game in motivation. But it's also about implications. We need to understand what is happening in the region, that it's different from 2018 or 19, right? The region, it's not the same region. It's not Maduro, as Chavez before, was part of a wave of left-wing populists coming in the 2000s. In the case of Chavez, it was 1999, right? And a whole wave that it's still there in other, still in some cases, in some countries like in Nicaragua, etc. But this is another wave. right? It's the right-wing populist wave that it was there with Bolsonaro in Brazil, it's there with Milei in Argentina, Bukele in El Salvador, Chile now with Cast. So we need to understand this in this sense that the region is now there to support Trump, to support the USA, to support this idea of making America great again. And it's not only about Trump's doctrine reproducing Monroe's doctrine or Roosevelt's colonial doctrine. It's the region accepting it. It's the region legitimizing it. It's the reason willing to accept that Trump 2.0 is more assertive and in a way uses different tools than Trump 1.0. So I think we need to take that into account, that the implications also for the region would be that we will see different kind of regional politics there, different kind of regionalist dynamics in terms of regional organizations and more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Daniel. Donatella, I see you unmuting yourself. Maybe you want to add something to this point on regional implications.
Very quickly, as Daniel asked, what implicated to make America great again? Well, think of it at the micro level. What made America great in other times? Well, that was the country where every immigrant wanted to go and still wants to go. That's the place where the rule of law is there, where there are economic opportunities. There was the so-called American way of life and the American dream that so many people wanted to try. Luck. So that is the great America that other people wanted to go to.
Thank you. That's an interesting
Real
angle.
big problem with immigration right now in the country.
Absolutely.
So being used as a tool against the country, depending on how you see it. So Venezuela has the position of Venezuela is very important because, as Daniel said, it's like a medium power. It was a very good power in Latin America before Chavez came to office, but it has been degraded very much for the last 25 years. But had a very strong position. It had a very strong economy. So it was a very good platform to start from there up.
Thank you, Donatella. And let's remind the audience that there are 8 million Venezuelan refugees, Venezuelan migrants who are part of the diaspora since 2014, which is most of them are in Colombia. Many millions are in the US as well. And this also features heavily in Trump's narrative. So it's important to also keep in mind. I'd like us to move away from the regional lens, of course, keeping in mind that these all spill over into each other, but move to the local. And I would like to focus this part of our discussion on our amazing panelists from Venezuela. So first, Donatella, I'd like to continue with you. I'd like to, because of time, ask 3 questions bundled up, and feel free to answer them in whatever order you feel. The first is plain and simple. From a local Venezuelan perspective, what do you think will happen next in Venezuela? What are your predictions, writ large? That's a tough one. Like, predictions are always hard, but this is a safe space. And on a related note, what do you think will happen to the opposition, right? We have heard a lot about Maria Corina Machado, the rest of the Venezuelan opposition abroad. Lastly, how are these events being discussed and framed in the Venezuelan media, both in the state-controlled media and in what's left of the free Venezuelan media, which you have been a great part of? What is the US media missing, and what are we not talking about, but we should be?
Okay, so let's go one at a time. It is not easy to predict anything, given the fluidity of the events. Just a couple of days ago, President Trump summoned a number of executives from the oil industry, US oil industry, and urged them or invited them to invest large amount of money reviving the Venezuelan oil industry, because this would benefit us all. I mean, the American people, the Venezuelan people. If we are to believe that such wealth would benefit both Americans and Venezuelans. However, first, we must give any investor, large or small, minimum guarantees that the rule of law will be respected totally removed from the psychotic ups and downs of the Venezuelan dictatorship, that the playing field will be level, and that investors will be able to recover their investment within a reasonable time frame. To do this, it is necessary to dismantle the entire structure of the dictatorship, from the executive branch through the entire judicial system and what is known as the National Assembly, which is full of regime supporters, down to the smallest details, such as commercial registries, notaries, all of which are prone to stealing users' time and money. And then there is everything related to law enforcement. That is a separate issue right there. Dismantling 26 years of abuses takes time, and it will take as long as necessary to achieve this. And then we have the restructuring of entities such as the National Electoral Council, its board of directors, and the tally counting system. That's a huge issue right there. We could either see that the results of the July 28, 2024 elections would be respected or recognized, and Mr. Edmundo González Urrutia would be sworn in for office, or we could go to new elections. Maria Corina could, in that instance, Maria Corina could run for office and she would win again for a landslide. Regarding Maria Corina again, she is the leader of the opposition. She will undoubtedly be part of the transition because she really has the true pulse of the civilian population. Perhaps not yet of the military, which is why the US has to deal with figures such as Delcy Rodriguez until relative stability is achieved. It is clear that in Latin America, if the military do not want democracy, you will not have democracy. This has been true in Venezuela for 26 years, in Cuba for 66 years, and in Nicaragua for more than 15 years. So the American public must understand this. The freedoms enjoyed here in the United States are in place, partly because of the military subordination to the civilian world. Latin America has not, in Latin America, this has not been often the case. Latin America's history has been plagued with military coups. Why? Because the military have the weapons and have used them against the civilian world on many occasions. If you have the weapons, you have the power. In the case of Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado undoubtedly has the trust of the civilian population, as I mentioned. What is needed is for the military, especially those in the upper echelons of command, to decide if it will be much more costly for them to continue supporting the dictatorship than to support freedom and democracy, and perhaps avoid being tried for crimes against humanity. Doing so will undoubtedly, again, mean giving up a lot of money, though. Perhaps that is why we are still fighting for the U.S. demands to be met in terms of release of political prisoners and other measures that will pave the way for an orderly transition. Maria Corina will undoubtedly, again, be head of state, but there is still a long way to go. She needs the support of the U.S. to pave the way and remove many obstacles. Actually, she's set to meet with President Trump on Thursday, as per Reuters. Let's see what comes out from that meeting. She's an extremely intelligent woman. She knows what Venezuela needs, and she will know how to negotiate it with the United States.
Thank you, Donatella. Maybe you want to comment on the role of the media and what the media is missing, but maybe we can...
Very quickly.
Yes, please. If we could.
These events are being reported by the media with much caution, with extreme caution, and the Venezuelan independent press is extremely limited in its coverage. Reporters Without Borders reported recently that 14 journalists and press workers and international journalists were illegally detained while carrying out their reports. And some 200 journalists are in the Colombian border waiting to come into Venezuela. They have asked for visas, but they have not been approved. And they will not get into the country on their own because they risk being detained, their material being erased or even deleted or confiscated. And There is also this decree 5200, which persecutes anyone who supports the U.S. actions in Venezuela. So people are viewed. What the U.S. media omits, it's a lot of background information, and some fellow journalists may even be ideologically biased or responding to guidelines from their respective media outlets to cover the Venezuelan situation by the book. So it is very complicated. Again, the media are very cautious, trying to cover the events as much as they can, but with much care. But, I mean, being very careful. That is what I meant to say.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the independent journalism that you have done for so many years for the Venezuelan people to bring new perspectives and less constrained ones to the foreground. So let me just move to Douglas, because we're running out of time, unfortunately. But Douglas, you're an expert in macroeconomics and risk assessment. Speaking of intentions, which we have touched on, how heavily do you think oil features in the equation? Should motivation matter in the first place, or should just results matter?
Oil is clearly a top-tier driver and tool in the current U.S. approach. It's the fastest way to find, condition, and control the post-crisis. The alia jacta of Julius Caesar has taken place, so there is no way back. Now I have to deal with the aftershocks. Therefore, you've got a lot of motives, but how do motivations matter in the first place? It depends on which standard you're speaking of, law, legitimacy, or strategy. Under international law, legality, motive usually doesn't save you. The state of motive, oil, democracy, or counter narcotics is generally less important than whether there are the legal conditions met under the UN Charter that might justify military intervention or the use of force. Finland has accepted legal basis like self-defense after an armed attack. This is a bit awkward. Legitimacy in terms of political, morally, motivations matter a lot. Even an action is arguably lawful. There is a perception that is resource-driven. For instance, to erode regional support, increase domestic resistance inside the target country, and make any transition look like a protectorate. So you have to be very careful on how you market this or how you sell this argument. And there's a lot of damage. It's Trump saying, I'm in charge, I'm the president, I'm the acting president of a country. You have to be very careful on how you speak in these terms, because what you do with your hands, you could destroy it in very few weeks. In terms of strategy, as to the durability of the motivations matter because they shape outcomes. So you have the risk of higher sabotage and insurgents around energy infrastructure. You've got more elite bargaining and corruption around contracts. You've got less credibility for anti-crime or government's goals. So all this plays into the contraries in terms of strategy. So the motivations have to be very carefully assessed and sold to make a sense out of this. We got rid of Maduro, but we haven't gotten rid of the Diosdado Cabello or Delcy Rodriguez. They can wreak havoc there. So this is a very delicate time in terms of motivation on how to deal with the problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Donatella, for bringing us a Venezuelan perspective and for touching on issues that the international media does not always discuss. Because of time, I think we will move on to questions from the audience, right? So let me bundle some of them together. The first one actually touches on a lot of what we have been discussing already, right? Which is the tension, as I said, and as Donatella pointed out, the entire structure of the dictatorship has not been dismantled, right? And that is what most Venezuelans want. So there is kind of a tension between Venezuelans celebrating the toppling of an illegitimate, ruthless dictator and international law saying this is illegal and it is the breaking apart of the international rules-based order, right? So the first question I'm rephrasing, but should human rights have a priority over international law? Should there be a difference between deposing a legitimate leader versus an illegitimate one? I'll ask more of them. This is the first question from the audience. Let me get to more of them because of time. And we can all jump in and answer as we see fit. And the second question by Suvrat Aditya is, has the Venezuelan fiasco, what they call it, opened Pandora's box? And might we see countries like China and Russia following suit with respect to Taiwan and Ukraine? So a prediction to be made there. We have a question by Giovanni Alvarez that says, can we view this action in Venezuela as a milestone in the shift towards a new global order, where the UN system is part of the outdated model being replaced? So in summary, is the UN outdated? Is it being replaced? And is this just a harbinger of what's to come? Let's start with those three. Feel free to jump in.
Alejandro, I want to refer, because I saw that there were several questions, in fact, referring to what Douglas and also Hope discussed about this issue of legitimacy, right? Well, it's not legal, but legitimate, right? Think about I usually, when I teach on legitimacy in IR, I use the case of Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood was doing something that was considered not legal, but perhaps legitimate because of moral things or normative things, even emotional. So legitimacy, the politics of legitimacy, it's a different thing, right? And I agree with what Douglas says, that in fact it's very important. Douglas said how you market it, how you sell this action. And what we need to understand is that when the US administration today is trying to legitimize, to justify the actions, they are speaking to their own audience. So they are caring about domestic legitimation much more than international legitimation. But just see what is happening with oil companies. US oil companies say, well, we are not sure we want to get to jump into this issue, right? We need to check if that's good for us also. So that puts the question on what are the real interests behind the motivations, as you said, and so what can happen also, right? When Trump said from the beginning, we are going to run it, right? We are going to run Venezuela, so through cooptation, it seems, just keeping the regime. And so is that real, or is just the justification? We need to separate there, right? So what can the region do here, and I will say that the whole international community, is try to pressure on or demand democratic transition. As Donatella was saying before, yes, there is a tradition in Latin America on military coups and then dictatorships. And we know that there's also a tradition on transitions to democracy, right? The whole literature about the 80s, it's about how Latin America transitioned into democracy. I'm originally from Uruguay. That's a very successful case of a gradual, let's say, transition from dictatorship to democracy. So I think we need to take into account all these issues when discussing what could help. It's not only about legal issues. It's not only about R2P is applied or not applying here. For sure that there were reasons that, to do something there, to change something there. But I think the question we need to ask now is, what should the regional community and the international community do now to make this initial, let's say, move turn into democratic transition and hopefully for the Venezuelans also a more free country.
Could I add something or complement something on the remarks from Daniel? Let's not forget that the business model has fundamentally changed. You guys are alluding to the good old days of the good old military dictatorships that were clean, and they at least had the good taste of not getting involved in drugs or in international terrorism, which is the norm right now. Right now, what Trump is doing right now, is trying to, okay, they locked the head of the regime, but they have to deal with the aftershocks. We have to secure and direct the oil, not just the oil physically, but the revenues, the financial flows that go with them. We have to reduce narcotic migration spillovers. You have to also push out displace the hostile external actors, namely Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, which are part of the equation. And then, with all this said and done, engineer a political transition, which will be financed by oil. So, what is Trump effectively trying to establish a choke point where he will dictate, or his government will dictate, who benefits, who will invest, who will receive these inflows, and displace all other participants. So this is a much more complicated checkboard, if you will.
Thank you both. I think that we've also received questions on the chat regarding which ties back to the question of legitimacy that Daniel was shedding light on. We have someone ask, how do we know what the majority of Venezuelans want? So I also like to remind some important context that I missed is that only in 2025, last year, Venezuela did have an election with an overwhelming majority, over 70% voting for the opposition, right?
Alejandro, let me complete with this that nobody ever makes a comment. Maduro lost under the same rule he imposed. His own electoral council imposed a series of rules which he imposed upon the opposition, and he lost under those rules. And then he decided to steal those elections, which is even more galling, if you will.
Absolutely. And so this is maybe important context that I was missing to provide the audience, but it should not be missed when we're speaking of legitimacy. That's the background and that lurks, right? Another question that came up is again related to predictions making Taiwan regarding Taiwan and Ukraine, and of course their main threats, China and Russia respectively. Does anyone have a take on whether the US actions will embolden its rivals in Taiwan and Ukraine?
I can answer that. So I think there's something particularly unique about the US vis-a-vis Venezuela as compared to, let's say, Russia and Ukraine or China and Taiwan. And that's in Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan, they have the backing of, let's say, a NATO and the United States. So we came into this situation where Venezuela didn't have their normal, like, kind of global power backing. Russia wasn't really interested in it. They're bogged down in a war. China is not really making moves in the hemisphere in that way. They're more interested in kind of economic investment. And so I think it's there's a higher risk and consequence set up because the US is so eager and positions itself to, let's say, defend Taiwan specifically. I also don't think it's out of the question that Putin has gone after Zelensky and just didn't achieve it. But I think, yeah, I think there's more ramifications for what this means for the international order than for necessarily those specific cases.
Let me just add this little thing. Maybe it will not really happen anything between Taiwan and China because China does not regard Taiwan's sovereignty. Instead, it regards regards Venezuela's sovereignty, but sovereignty the Chinese way, if you will. So again, rules, international law are fixed.
Asymmetric.
Fit the narrative. If it doesn't fit, it is not even mentioned. So I don't think nothing is going to happen between China and Taiwan if regarding this matter between United States and Venezuela. If something happens between China and Taiwan, it will be maybe next year when they feel they have the necessary capabilities, militarily speaking, and they have everything covered in order to invade Taiwan. But I don't think they are going to use the example of Venezuela and the United States for that matter.
Thank you both. This is very. I'd like to move on. Oh, you had a comment on this, if we could.
I could add a few tidbits here. One of the reasons that Trump is trying to corner the oil market, at least in the Western Hemisphere, is to make it even more expensive for China to import oil. Not under the old rules. Remember that China has a huge accounts receivable from Venezuela. and that meant a lot of oil that was transferred to third countries through China's intermediation. But this linkage has been cut. Now, China strategically depends 70-80% from imports of countries that are potentially adversarial, which will make it even more costly to take a decision vis-a-vis Taiwan in the future. So it's an oblique message from Trump to China. Be careful with what you will be doing. You don't mess with Taiwan, or else it will be very costly for you. And they're very used to falsifying statistics. As to population, for instance, everyone takes as a norm that they have 1.4 billion inhabitants, which is far from the truth for many valid reasons. But I won't get into that anyways. So they are much more sensitive and weaker than meets the eye, and that will be a factor in the years to come.
Thank you, Douglas. We have many questions in the QA section. I think many of them touch, an abundance of them touch on the question of the New World Order. One of our attendees calls it the possible new international disorder. Another attendee speaks of the context of substituting the current decision-making mechanism, which is the UN Security Council, and replacing it with unilateral military action, some of the topics we have already discussed right now. So I'd like to start by asking Daniel, who has written extensively on this topic, are we before a new international disorder?
Yeah, I think it's a key question here, right? Because at the end of the day, we are IR scholars, and for sure we care about geopolitical issues, right? Specific bilateral relations, or specific how this affects China, Taiwan, how this affects Russia, Ukraine, or even the Middle East and more. But I think from the broader view, it's the key, the systemic, what we call the systemic view, right? And in particular, from a constructivist perspective, right? Are normative pillars changing? Are the main, normative ideas that justify what the institutions, what we call the standards of behavior in IR, in international system, are changing? And I think yes. I mean, for sure, if we have this discussion in the last years, we discussed, for example, this in a paper on the populist international order. So what is changing? What are those normative pillars? Now it's clear that it's there, right? That there's clear territorial revisionism, there's clear ideological revisionism there. I think Hope said at the beginning, you discussed that R2P is not there anymore, right? There's no need to justify the use of force, of military force, right? It's there, right? We do it because we want, because it's our interest, and it's even a way of domestic legitimation, right? We do what we want. So I think there are some normative pillars that are different there. I'm not sure that everything will change. I'm also not sure that there will be a new order, right? A clear, I think it's erratic. I think it's exactly what you say, Alejandro. It's more a disorder, right? But we know that when there is vacuum, right? As in any case, when there is vacuum, someone will enter there. So yes, even if it's not, the consequence will not be intended, there will be probably an intended consequence, and this could affect the way China looks at it, and Russia and other players there. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to take these points into view. I will also say a last comment on this, and perhaps, I mean, this also show our world, right? Our IR world. Where is the global south there, right? Where were we in IR discussing Venezuela and how this might affect other places, right? This was, again, at least a 12-year crisis, both democratic institution, right? Institutional crisis, and both human rights crisis. Where we're discussing this, right? I remember trying to publish on these issues in the last year, or even presenting, and it was not, it was not in the agenda, IR agenda. So I think we also, as IR scholars, we need to discuss what is the role of what is happening in the global south, and how it, through diffusion, how it affects what is happening systemically, more broadly.
That is a fantastic note to end on, and I thank you, Daniel, because not only should we be discussing how the international global order is changing, but also how our study, discussion, and understanding of this is changing. And the discussion is moving more to places like Venezuela and Mexico at the same time that it is moving to great power competition, right? We're also focusing more on the global south in many ways. We have gone over time, unfortunately. Well, or fortunately, because we still have great quorum. But I would like to take the remaining minutes, the last 2 minutes, to thank the audience. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for asking all these magnificent questions and staying engaged. Most importantly, thank you to our fantastic panelists. Thank you, Hope. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Donatella. And thank you to the International Studies Association for facilitating this space. So I will leave it at that. We will close the Zoom now, and we hope for good outcomes for the people, mostly of Venezuela. And thank you for staying up to this point.
Thank you for moderating so well.
Thank you, Alejandro.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank you very much, Alejandro.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.